go ahead and jump to your module directory, and in your steps folder, go ahead and pick step 9, Ajax loading. In this example, what we're going to do is dynamically add inputs to a form through Ajax. So in a previous example, we demonstrated how to show or hide various inputs based on the state of other inputs, but one aspect of that is that the entire form needs to exist before those checks can be made. In using Ajax to dynamically load inputs, the form can have a certain structure at the beginning of the processing, and that structure can change by inputs being added or removed throughout the process. There are several use cases for this type of Ajax loading. The first is very similar to our example of using the state attribute, where we showed certain inputs based on the state of other inputs. So we might do that, but dynamically load it in as needed instead of loading it initially. Another use case would be where somebody is going to be inputting repeated user information. So for example, they're registering a family, and we don't know how many members belong to their family. So it will begin with a single input because we assume that there's a single member of their family at least, and then there could be a more button that adds additional inputs as they go building up their family structure. And if we use Ajax for this, then it changes the form structure altogether, and so the form will be processed properly through validation and submission. The Ajax loading in Drupal 7 is actually pretty easy to use, and so that's one good reason to use it instead of a custom solution. The second good reason is that through each step of the form building process, the form is cached. So if we add additional inputs through JavaScript, for example, but we don't change the underlying structure of the form, then those additional inputs won't be recognized and passed through as values to the validation and submission functions. So in order to change the underlying structure of the form, we need to use Drupal's built-in Ajax functionality. Okay, go ahead and open up this 9th step and copy the entire source code and paste it over the code that's currently in your input.module file and save it. We've added 2 parts to this file. The first is in the function input more form, we've added some additional inputs and some processing here. So if you scroll down, we have our new computer stats OS input. So this is for an operating system. And we have another input called OS verify, which is also in the computer stats field set. And we have some logic here that checks for a value in the form states array. So we've seen the form states array used in the validation and submit functions, but here it's used in the actual form building process, and this happens whenever the form is rebuilt for Ajax processing. And finally, we've added a function for the Ajax callback, and we'll go through all this in detail. Okay, so let's take a look at the first input that we're adding for the operating system. We're giving it a title of operating system, a type of select, so it'll be a select input. We're giving it options of OS X, Linux, and Windows. And notice that we're using a function called Drupal map assoc, which is useful when creating options inside of a select, radios, or checkboxes type input. What this does is it takes a flat array and it makes it associative by assigning the keys to the value. So we'll take this value of OXX and make that the key as well. Our next attribute is Ajax, and this is where we set the information that will allow us to load additional inputs based on the state of this input. So we want whenever this input changes to a different operating system to load a different value for our next input, which is just a checkbox that says, are you sure that blank is your operating system? So it's just a validation check. Our first parameter that we're passing to the Ajax attribute is called Callback. And this is the function that gets called that returns the HTML or the render array that's going to populate what we set in our next attribute, wrapper. And wrapper is the ID of the HTML element that's going to get replaced. So anything that's in here will get sucked out and filled in with the item that we're passing through our callback. Now to generate our next input, which is just that verification checkbox for the operating system, we can use several different methods for logic. But we're using a method here that uses a limited amount of source code. What we need to do is to at least add some markup to our form that has an element with this ID in it. So we need that added to the form in order to fill it in later. So we can do that by using a type of markup. So we're setting the type of this input to markup, and we're giving it a prefix of a div, and we're assigning it an ID that's identical to the wrapper. So the idea here is that we're wrapping this div around anything that we want to replace out based on the changes that happen in the input that we just set. During the initial build process of this form, this is as far as we want to go. It's only when the form is altered to select an operating system that we want to display our verification checkbox that checks whether the user has selected the right operating system. This form array will be called during that initial build process, but it will also be called by the Ajax processing and rebuild. And during that process, we can use the form states array, particularly the values inside of that array, in order to check the values of the inputs that have been currently selected. So what we'll do is check for the form state of the operating system input, and if that's not blank, what we're going to do is add our new input. So we could add a fresh input that has a unique ID and make sure that we're adding this prefix and suffix to it. But instead what we can do is leverage our input that we created for this markup and simply override the type, so now it's a checkbox, and add any additional attributes that we want to it. That way we don't have to repeat this prefix and suffix attributes. So what we're doing here is taking our form array and we're grabbing the computer stats input, particularly the field set, and the OS verify input, which we created as the markup here, and we're setting the type to checkbox, and then we're setting the title to are you sure you're using, and then we're using a placeholder inside of the T function to fill in our operating system. And that's all that we're changing here inside of the form. Our second step is to make sure that we're returning the correct value, either HTML or a render array, to replace this div here. So if we scroll down, we've created a function here called input OS verify Ajax callback. And this is the callback that we set in our callback attribute inside of our Ajax parameter in the operating system input. And this function gets both the form array and the form state array, and we can grab any items from the form array and pass those back to fill in this div. So all we're going to do is take this new form item that we've created during this form building process and simply return that. So all you see here is a return of form computer stats OS verify. So just to kind of step back a couple of steps again, the first time the form is loaded, this OS verify input is markup, and it's just containing this invisible div opening and closing tag. During the next part of the process, when a user selects an input for this operating system input, at that point the form gets rebuilt, and this callback that was registered on the initial build is called, and anything that gets returned from that, and if we scroll down here we see that what's getting returned from that is this part here that we're generating when the form gets changed, and it's taking that and replacing out this div with that content. So even though the code is fairly simple, wrapping your mind around that process might take a couple runs. But let's go ahead and take a look at it in action, and then you can play with the code and kind of see what changes you can make to it. So go ahead and make sure that your module is saved. And let's go ahead and go back to our form. And we're going to refresh it. Okay, now we have a new input called operating system right here. And what we're going to do is select an input. And when we do, we see our little loading graphic that says, hey, we're loading something here, give it a minute. And we see our new input, our checkbox, and we see that the operating system that we selected was replaced out as we had set in our T function in our form array. So if we change this, again, this value will change to match the value that we've selected. And if we select nothing, then that input will disappear. This has been a pretty simple example of using the Ajax callback to dynamically generate form elements inside of a form, but the same principles apply to virtually any other type of dynamic form. So for example, the use case we talked about earlier where a user needs to input additional family members would probably involve a button that says add a new family member. And when that button is clicked, then the new row of inputs for that family member would be added, and there would be an additional add a family member button. So in this case, what we would do is that button would be an input, and we would add the Ajax attributes to that. We would assign it a callback that would return an array that would be all of the inputs for all of the family members that get generated in the form. And then inside the form render array, we would have a loop that would go through however many members they currently have and generate the form items that need to be added for each one of those members. So it's basically a three-step process. The first step is adding the Ajax attribute to the input that you want to trigger the change. The next step is to add logic inside of the form array function that generates or removes the inputs that are going to be dynamically changed. And finally, you have the Ajax callback function, which is a very simple function that will typically simply return the form element or elements that are going to be filling in the wrapper that's defined in the Ajax attribute. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next example.